You know that feeling, right? You've studied, you know the material inside and out, but the second that test paper hits your desk, your mind just goes blank. It is one of the most frustrating experiences, and in this explainer, we're going to dig into why it happens. And here's a hint. It has surprisingly little to do with what you actually know.
Wow. I mean, that just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It perfectly captures that paradox. The knowledge is there, the understanding is solid, but when it matters most, the performance just completely falls apart. So what is really going on?
Okay, so let's dive in. When this happens, when a student's performance collapses, we usually point to a pretty standard list of reasons.
We've all heard these, and we've probably all used them. Test anxiety, pressure, stress, nerves, or hey, maybe you just didn't prepare enough. These are the usual suspects. And yeah, they feel true. But what our source material suggests is that they're really just scratching the surface. They're describing the symptoms, not the actual disease.
So what if the problem isn't just you? What if it's something way deeper, something baked into the very structure of what a test is and what it does to our brains? What if the test itself is the problem?
And that brings us to the core idea of this whole explainer. We might need to completely reframe how we think about assessments, because they aren't just a simple measurement of knowledge. There's something our source calls an identity pressure event.
And here you can see the two competing views side by side. On the one hand, you have the common idea. A test is just a neutral tool to see what you've learned. But on the other hand, you have the structural reality. An assessment is loaded with judgment, comparison, and real-world consequences. All of a sudden, it stops being about the material, and it starts being about you.
Okay, so what is this identity pressure? Well, think of it like this. It's the effect a test has that basically forces your brain to switch its main priority. It stops focusing on the cool stuff, like learning and recalling information, and instead, it shifts into a defensive, self-protective mode. Because under all that pressure, your brain isn't asking, what's the answer to question 3? It's asking these other, much scarier questions. Are you keepable? Do you actually belong here? What is this grade going to say about you as a person? Suddenly, the stakes aren't a fact or formula anymore. The stakes are your very identity.
So your brain perceives this massive threat to your identity. What does it do? It goes into full-on self-defense mode. And really understanding this defense mechanism, well, that's the key to everything.
Going blank, freezing up, that sudden wave of panic. I mean, does any of this sound familiar? These aren't just random glitches in the system. They are the direct, predictable result of your brain's defense protocols kicking right in.
And this is maybe the most important point of the whole explainer. When you go blank on a test, it is not because you've forgotten the information. It is not a memory failure.
No, what's actually happening is what's called a coherence failure. So imagine all your knowledge is this beautiful, intricate web of connected ideas, right? Well, under that intense identity pressure, the whole web just destabilizes. The connections snap, the info is still in your brain somewhere, but you can't get to it because all the pathways have collapsed.
And that just completely reframes the whole experience, doesn't it? Blanking out isn't a sign of weakness, it's a form of structural self-preservation. Your brain has basically made a split-second calculation. Protecting your sense of self from the threat of this test is way more important than remembering some formula.
And this perfectly explains that incredibly frustrating gap between how you perform when you're just practicing versus in the actual exam. Because it turns out those two environments are just fundamentally different worlds.
So, look at this. When you're practicing, the identity threat is super low. Your brain is stable, it's integrated, it's focused on learning. But step into the exam room and everything changes. Identity gets compressed, you're under time pressure, the consequences are sky high, your brain's architecture literally shifts into a defensive, narrowed survival mode. The knowledge doesn't transfer because, in a very real sense, you're operating with a different brain.
So if exams are so hostile to our brains, why do some people seem to just sail right through them? You know, who are these good test takers?
Well, according to this way of thinking, a good test taker isn't necessarily smarter than you. Not at all. They just happen to have a brain structure, a cognitive architecture, that's more compatible with these high-pressure environments. Their internal web of knowledge just stays stable. It stays coherent, even when their identity is under fire. It's an architectural advantage, not an intellectual one.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. If tests aren't really great tools for measuring what we've learned, then what is their real function in our education system? Well, the source material argues that their primary job isn't about learning at all. It's about sorting.
And this creates a really dangerous cycle. Check it out. First, your performance gets a grade. Then that grade gets encoded into your identity.
You stop thinking, I did poorly on that one test, and you start believing, I am bad at math. And once that identity takes hold, it actively constrains and limits what you even think you can learn in the future.
And this brings us to the core conflict, the central tension of it all. Real, deep learning requires a sense of safety. You need the freedom to explore, to mess up, to be wrong. But sorting requires pressure. It needs pressure to create a ranking, a hierarchy, and the thing is, these two goals are just structurally incompatible. You can't have both at the same time.
And the long-term costs of a system built on sorting are huge. Students start avoiding whole subjects where they feel threatened. Their idea of who they are and what they're capable of just shrinks. They start rejecting entire fields of knowledge, not because they aren't interested, but as a way to protect their identity from that feeling of collapse. It's what you'd call a learned limitation.
So, all of this leads to a final and honestly pretty profound takeaway. We need to start asking a totally different kind of question about testing.
A test doesn't just measure the system, it changes the system it measures. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. A test isn't some passive mirror that just reflects your ability. It is an active, powerful force that literally reshapes the person being tested. It changes what knowledge you can access, what you believe is possible for yourself, and what kind of future you think you can have. So the real question this leaves us with isn't just, how can we make better tests? The much deeper question is, what are we actually doing to a person's identity every single time we put them through one? And when you look at it this way, it seems like the architecture of the brain itself answers that question, long before any grades are ever handed out.